The old house loomed over them, a silhouette against the bruised sky. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "You sure about this, Mark?" she asked, her voice barely a murmur against the wind. Mark, his eyes fixed on the house, didn't seem to hear. He was already halfway up the overgrown path, drawn towards the house like a moth to a flame. The air grew colder as they approached, a palpable shift that sent goosebumps erupting on Sarah's arms. Mark, oblivious or uncaring, continued his steady march towards the front door, its paint peeling like scabs. The wind picked up, whipping around them, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic and unpleasant. Sarah's hand went to the silver locket at her throat, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "Mark, wait," she called out again, her voice laced with apprehension. He finally paused, turning back to look at her, a strange glint in his eyes. "Don't you feel it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low and excited. Mark, ever the adventurer, dismissed her fears with a wave of his hand. "It's just an old house, love," he said, his tone reassuring, though his eyes held a different kind of excitement. He reached for the rusted doorknob, the metal cold and rough beneath his touch. The door creaked open, as if sighing after years of neglect, revealing a cavernous entrance hall shrouded in shadows. Dust motes danced in the thin sliver of moonlight that pierced the gloom. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, a musty, oppressive weight that settled in Sarah's lungs. She could hear the faint scuttling of unseen creatures, and the rustle of fabric from somewhere deep within the house. The flickering light they had seen earlier was gone, plunging the upper floors into an impenetrable darkness. "Anyone home?" Mark called out, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. The only answer was the creak of the house settling around them. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket closer. The temperature had dropped noticeably, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into her very marrow. They moved deeper into the house, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The air grew heavy with the weight of unseen history, the ghosts of laughter and sorrow clinging to the very walls. Sarah could almost hear the murmur of voices, the faint strains of music from a long-ago party. Or was it just the wind whistling through the gaps in the boarded-up windows? The drawing room was in a state of elegant disrepair. Dust-covered furniture sat draped in white sheets, resembling ghostly apparitions in the dim light. A grand piano, its surface scratched and dull, dominated one wall. Sarah swore she could see the faint impression of fingers on the keys, as if someone had just been playing. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. "It's sad, isn't it?" Mark mused, running his hand along the dusty surface of a nearby table. "All this history just left to rot." Sarah nodded, unable to shake the feeling that they were intruding on something private, something sacred. Later, huddled around a flickering lantern in what was once a grand dining room, they researched the history of Blackwood Manor. The heavy tome Mark had pried from a cobweb-laden shelf spoke of a family torn apart by tragedy, a series of unfortunate events that culminated in the disappearance of the last remaining heir. The details were scant, shrouded in rumor and speculation. "Some say the house drove them mad," Mark read aloud, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness of the room. "Others whisper of a family curse, a darkness that followed them through generations." He looked up, his eyes gleaming in the lantern light. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Sarah, however, found it anything but fascinating. The stories, whether true or folklore, sent chills down her spine. "It's one thing to read about it," she said, her voice tight with apprehension, "but to actually be here..." She couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of the house, its history of sorrow and despair, pressed down on her, suffocating her. Mark, lost in his own world of historical intrigue, didn't seem to notice her unease. Against Sarah's better judgment, they found themselves drawn to the room mentioned in the book, the site of the infamous seance. It was a small circular chamber at the end of a narrow hallway. The air was noticeably colder, and the scent of mildew and decay was almost overpowering. A single dusty window offered a glimpse of the moon, casting long, eerie shadows. The remnants of the seance were still evident, a circular table surrounded by chairs draped in cobwebs. Sarah could almost feel the residual energy, a tangible sense of fear and desperation. "This is where it happened," Mark whispered, his voice hushed with excitement and trepidation. "Mark, please, let's just go," she pleaded, her voice tight with fear. The air crackled with anticipation. Mark, his eyes gleaming with a strange fervor, began to arrange the objects on the table, mimicking the setup described in the book. He lit a few candles he'd found in the kitchen, their flames casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Sarah, her heart pounding in her chest, watched him with growing unease. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, this is crazy, even for you." He ignored her, his attention focused on the task at hand. He closed his eyes and began to speak, his voice low and rhythmic, reciting words from the book, words in a language she didn't understand. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room seeming to deepen and writhe. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Sarah gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She could hear Mark scrambling for the lighter, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Sarah awoke to the sound of Mark's frantic voice calling her name. She was lying on the cold, hard floor, her head throbbing, a dull ache radiating from somewhere behind her eyes. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of Mark's lighter. He was kneeling beside her, his face etched with worry and relief. "Sarah, are you all right?" "What happened?" he asked, his voice shaky with concern. She sat up slowly, her head spinning, and looked around the room. It was then that she noticed it. A section of the wall where the wallpaper had been torn away, revealing a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Mark followed her gaze and his eyes widened. He quickly scrambled to his feet and approached the opening, holding the lighter aloft. A faint light emanated from within, beckoning them forward. The secret room was small and dusty, lit by a single flickering oil lamp that hung precariously from a rusty hook on the wall. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and cloying, the smell of blood. Sarah's stomach churned, and she fought back a wave of nausea. Mark, his back to her, was staring intently at something on the far wall. "Mark, what is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to face her, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. His hand gestured towards the wall. "Look," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sarah followed his gaze and gasped. The wall was covered in strange symbols and diagrams, drawn in what appeared to be dried blood. There were arcane symbols, geometric patterns, and crudely drawn figures that seemed to writhe and contort before her very eyes. As Mark's fingers brushed against the blood-drawn symbols, the room seemed to shift around them. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows on the walls danced with renewed vigor. Sarah felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Mark, stop!" she cried, her voice sharp with fear. "Let's just go!" But Mark, lost in his own world of morbid fascination, didn't seem to hear her. He pressed his palm against the wall, his fingers splaying across the bloody inscription. A low rumbling sound echoed through the room, and the floor beneath their feet began to vibrate. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the walls seemed to close in on them. "Mark, what's happening?" Sarah screamed, her voice shrill with panic. Panic surged through Sarah, cold and sharp. The walls were mere feet away, the passage back to the seance room closing rapidly. Mark, his face pale with terror, was frantically pulling at the loose stones, desperate to find a way out. "It's no use," Sarah cried, her voice raw with fear. "We're trapped." But even as she spoke, her eyes darted around the shrinking space, searching for any possible escape. And then she saw it, a small rectangular opening high up on the wall, partially concealed by cobwebs. It looked like a ventilation shaft, barely large enough for a child to fit through. "Mark there!" she shouted, pointing to the opening. He followed her gaze, his eyes widening with a flicker of hope. "Help me up!" he yelled, grabbing her hand. With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah pushed herself up, her fingers scraping against the rough stone. Mark boosted her from behind, his hands firm on her waist. Sarah tumbled through the darkness, the rough stone scraping against her skin. She didn't know how long she fell, how far she traveled through the bowels of the house. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the suffocating blackness. Finally, with a bone-jarring thud, she landed on something solid. Gasping for breath, she lay there, her body trembling with shock. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. She appeared to be in a narrow, dirt-floored tunnel, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Where was she? Which way should she go? And what had become of Mark? She called out his name, her voice echoing strangely, but there was no answer. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through, extinguishing her light. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the tunnel, chilling her to the bone.